Hey there, just a heads up, I get a bit loud during this one, so if you're falling asleep to these videos or need a trigger warning, you might want to skip to the timestamp on screen. Asyle, Tropical Island Survival, Week 26, Day 1. I was planning on finishing the transmitter repairs today, but scanning the horizon from the solar tower early in the morning made me aware of another boat approaching, so I locked up and packed myself into the panic room again. I took the radio and some other parts with me so I could tinker with them, knowing I would probably be in there for several hours, if not all day. This time, I watched the boat approach until I figured they were probably close enough to see me, and that was when I retreated into the panic room. I watched as they made a pass by my base, and made a landing on the beach out front first this time. Clearly a different boat, coming from a different direction, with different people. They were probably informed of my presence by the previous crew. They had a look around the base, and started calling out, but this time, I heard one of them speaking in English. I thought I was over it, given how depressed I'd been the past couple of days. But that only meant I was less prepared now for how hard it wrenched my guts. To finally hear someone speaking that I could talk to again. Saying things like, "Hello, is anyone there?" and "We're not going to hurt you." It felt like there was a sharp steel hook in my heart, trying to drag me back up those stairs and out into the open. All I could do at that point to protect myself was plug the hearing trumpet and cover my ears. I wanted so badly to believe that they wouldn't hurt me, that they'd take me back home to my family, to the cold. But after a little while of calling and looking around, I watched in horror as they started wrecking up the place, ripping up taros and snapping the small pump mills up the path, mostly because they were the easiest things to break, and they clearly didn't carry the equipment with them to cause any more damage. They even smashed up the music machine just because it was there. Then they left, going around to the bunker, loading the contraband onto their dinghy and back onto their boat. Once again, in my dark hole, I started to cry. It almost would have been better if they'd wrecked up the place the first time, because at least I was kind of mentally prepared for it. I let myself hope that they were nice, or at least not too bad. Just people trying to get by in a harsh world. And I had that trust betrayed, crushed underfoot before my very eyes. All it does is reinforce something I've felt my entire life but never fully allowed myself to believe, that this world does not want me! That phrase echoed in my soul for hours, in a form more visceral than words can describe. I wept more bitterly than I can ever remember having done before, and I'm not sure if I eventually fell asleep, curled up in the corner. But when I finally checked the periscope again, it looked like they were gone. I took a few more cautious looks around with my periscope and telescope. before wearily assessing the damage. I gathered the yams and set them by the rivulet, the frames they rested on having been smashed. They'll stay wet there until tomorrow. The taros actually weren't hurt that badly, because all they did was tear up the leaves instead of the corms underneath. A few of the decorative and functional plants around the buildings were trampled, but they'll bounce back. That's not really the point, though. Most of the important stuff inside the buildings was protected, thanks to the sturdy doors and locks. The only thing they managed to break on the workshop was a few of the cups on the water wheel, but they should be easy enough to fix. However, the condenser pot, solar flower bed for the refrigeration system outside the kitchen, got smashed up pretty badly, and will need several parts replaced. The bathhouse was also poorly protected. My beautiful dining room set has been trashed, the toilet pot shattered, and the shower head torn from its mounting, now spraying water all over what's left of the dining room. The saltwater turbines have been knocked over and trampled underfoot, but the pumps actually seem to be mostly intact. I guess they didn't understand what they were for, and therefore how to do the most damage to me. This almost upsets me more, because it suggests that they may have sought destruction for its own sake, not because they needed to, but just because they could. The sundial has also been destroyed, though they couldn't do much to displace the pedestal under it. At first, I just sat there for a while, stunned and dazed, sobbing a little, before deciding that I needed to repair the important stuff first, starting with the pump turbines and water wheel. There were actually several parts of the turbine still intact that I could use to speed up the process, but a moment of reluctance caused me to quickly realize the truth in the statement. Starting over is often harder than starting up, because it feels like all those prior efforts were wasted now that I have to repeat them. What's the point of starting over if it didn't work the first time? This effort was also not helped by the fact that I didn't properly have breakfast this morning, as I was basically glued to the periscope the whole time, and my hands were starting to shake from hypoglycemia. So I soon stopped for lunch before I made the turbine any worse or cut my hands by mistake. However, when I went to clean the dishes and encountered the slightest resistance, I smashed my own plates on the ground. Before, I was sad and hurt. Now I'm mad. I didn't do anything to those people. They couldn't even be sure that I was here. They attacked me and specifically targeted my means of survival just because there was a chance that I might have interfered with theirs, or more likely, their source of wealth rather than their subsistence, though I have no way of knowing that. Why shouldn't I do the same to them, to all humans if I ever get out of here? In that case, why should I try to leave at all? I started having a meltdown, screaming and hopping up and down like a child throwing a tantrum. This has only happened to me a handful of times in my life, losing all control for a few seconds, before stopping just as suddenly as I began, my mind completely clear again, like some kind of short-lived dissociative fugue. Even in the midst of my grief and rage, logic reminded me that not all humans have attacked me. They don't all deserve my wrath. And making myself a threat only makes me a bigger target. My secrecy, my anonymity, protects me. But at the same time, I can't let the smugglers do this to me again. They will be back. They've been here before, and they will come again. as long as this place is useful to them. I cleaned up the mess I made and got back to work on the turbines, all the while trying to think of things I could do to protect myself. There's no telling what the smugglers may bring back with them to try and finish the job they started, so I can't just stay hidden, or they will destroy my works again, maybe with dynamite. I could build traps, even sea mines to defend my island from them. But as angry and frightened as I am, I don't actually want to hurt them, even if they want to hurt me. Besides, if any of them survived, what would I do? Kill them? Take care of them? Imprison them here with me? No, attacking them, or doing anything to instigate their aggression, is not going to end in my favor. However, if I destroy the bunker, they'll have nowhere to hide their contraband, and they might leave me alone. This may remove my greatest chance of getting out of here, or getting word to the outside world for rescue, or my greatest obstacle to that goal. Then again, after today, after those self-depreciating echoes in my head, what is the world to me but dead? If they don't want me, why should I even concern myself with going back? Though I can tell an ember of desire remains, it's currently overshadowed, and I've more or less made up my mind. To aid me in destroying the bunker, in addition to making a replacement toilet, shower head, and clay parts for the refrigeration system, I also made the parts for that dedicated nitric acid bubbler I was thinking about a week or so ago. For this design, while the bubbler itself is largely the same as the original, I made a long clay tube to act as a more effective fractionating column, which will accept a pump at the top, which shouldn't get eaten away as easily as the last one. This also connected to the spark tube, which I also decided to replace, having added a shard of broken glass as a viewport, so I could see the spark working. Once the new bubbler is finished, I can use the old bubbler for other, more diverse chemistry projects. Once I was done, I washed up and got ready to sleep. As I tried to drift off, pensively at first, I tried to convince myself that I could sleep a little more easily tonight. Not only was there nothing left on the island for the smugglers to come back for anytime soon, besides me, but I also had enough data points to conclude that they probably come on a regular cycle, a little under every 2 months. It's not enough data yet to be too confident, so let's err on the side of caution and say they could come again within the next month. That gives me a deadline by which to get ready for their return. Week 26, Day 2. I checked the horizon again when I got up in the morning and started my morning chores, chucking the various clay parts into both kilns to get as many things in process today as I could, invigorated and slightly panicked by this newfound deadline. I conducted my morning chores. Again, the octopi got away, and I realized I'd once again left the electrolysis cell on for too long. For today, I just removed the plate and set it aside for later, leaving the 5th plate to form over another 3 days, and finish on day 5 this week if I don't install the 4th plate beforehand. I finished up cleaning up the mess from the broken toilet, which I probably should have dealt with yesterday, but didn't have the mental energy, before thoroughly washing with soap and ethanol to disinfect myself. Next, I started working on replacing the aeroponic growth surface for the yams. Again, wasn't really broken too badly, because the smugglers were apparently in a hurry. It was really just a couple of bamboo troughs that got snapped, and I soon had the vines replanted. However, there were many displaced yams, so most of the big ones I stored in the cellar, and the small ones I set under the troughs to start growing again. A couple I set aside for lunch, and when I was done, I decided to start building a fence around the garden, so this would never happen again. I'm kind of kicking myself now that I didn't do it when I was still building bamboo fences around the whole compound. But at the same time, I need to cut myself some slack, because I was exhausted at that time, and I had no way of knowing for sure they'd attack my garden. The garden fence was a relatively easy job compared to what I'd done already. I chopped down several lengths of bamboo, stabbed some of them into the ground for fence posts, and tied/jointed on the others for crossbars, too close together for a person to squeeze through, and too high to jump over. Of course, someone could always climb it, so I looked around the forest for some thorny vines. Back home, there would have been abundant blackberry vines that I could have used as all-natural razor wire, but I managed to find an adequate, though less prolific, substitute here, and made a note to describe it in my notebooks later. The fence mostly needed to be applied to the front of the garden, as the sides were mostly covered by my bamboo hedge, and the back was up against a mountain, so the fence didn't take me too long to complete. At the end of the day, I pulled my clay parts from the kiln and set them aside for later. Probably tomorrow, but it's hard to say with all I need to do around here. I then stopped and thought about if there were any other clay items I would need by tomorrow that I could leave drying overnight. I'd been thinking throughout the day that I needed something to protect myself if the worst came to pass. While I noticed they were armed with pistols, it's unlikely they'd be packing anything stronger than that, like AK-47s or something, because the only people they'd likely have to fight on the high seas would be the coast guards or even navies of other countries, which would probably have whole gunboats at their disposal. If anything, they would probably be relying mostly on stealth and persuasion to smuggle successfully. With that in mind, I remembered that the Mythbusters once managed to make a bulletproof material out of bathroom tiles capable of stopping buckshot, so I decided to try doing the same, as I'd certainly gotten some practice making tiles. The problem I foresaw with this scheme, however, was that it would be a pain to have to wear all day, every day. It would be hot and heavy, making me weak from wearing it, and slow if I were pursued. I'd probably just take it off and only have a few minutes to grab it if surprised, which will almost inevitably be the case when they come back. Still, I considered it to be better safe than sorry, to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, as Dad once said. So I made up a batch of tile to dry overnight, taking care to add little holes to them so I could sew them onto a garment. Before going to bed, I made a quick description of the thorny vines I found in my nature journal to help me wind down a little. Needlethorn vine. Flowering shrub with very long, narrow thorns, and small leaves growing parallel to each other from a central stalk, kind of reminiscent of ferns. Week 26, Day 3. I got up, checked the horizon, and did my morning chores, giving up on the octopus pots for today, before getting back to work on the fence. A fence without gates can't protect anything, so I spent the morning working on a front gate for the garden, making it in a grate pattern because I was in a bit of a hurry, but also kind of wanted it to look nice, and I didn't need to keep anyone from seeing what was on the other side of it. It did need a lock though, so I spent some time in the workshop building one. It was a sufficiently meditative and relaxing activity that it helped me calm down. I'm intentionally trying this time to avoid slipping into and sustaining weeks' worth of panic like when I found out about the smugglers the first time. I even took the time to make the gate pretty, building the framework around it into an arch that flowed gracefully into the rest of the fence structure. I installed the gate before having an early lunch and building a second locked gate on the west side of the garden, leading into the orchard area. This path is technically accessible from the jungle, and the one I normally take to reach the chicken houses and perform my morning foraging. So by putting a gate here, I could be relatively sure that I only needed to defend my base from a single direction, namely the ocean. When I was done, I pulled the tiles from the kiln to cool, and took a minute to slow down and catch up on the repair work I'd been neglecting. The toilet and shower head were pretty quick and easy to reinstall in the bathhouse. As for the refrigeration system, fortunately, since most of the critical components for the adsorption mechanism were just bamboo pieces jointed together, they were relatively easy to replace or fit back together once I'd refilled them with salt and fixed the reflectors back in place. A little latex helped seal the system back up, along with any breaks in the hoses, before finally refilling it with ethanol, as a lot had leaked out when it was broken. After that, the only things left on my fix list were the dining room set and the sundial. The former would take the better part of the day, so I focused on the latter. Rebuilding the sundial itself was trivial, so I decided to at least have a little fun with it and improve the design, since I had enough time to kill, but not enough to get anything really big and important done. I got some scraps of bamboo and used them to encircle the pedestal before filling the frame up with a mix of concrete. The idea was that when it finishes setting tomorrow, it'll look kind of like a Greco-Roman column, which once again reminded me of all the cool, random architecture of Myst, and helped me loosen up a little. I should have plenty of time to get ready for when the smugglers come back, at this rate, so there's no reason to get worked up about it. Week 26, Day 4. I got up, checked the horizon, and went about my morning chores as usual before stripping a whole bunch of bamboo into cords and loading it onto the loom. The plan was to create a relatively fine mesh to mount my armor plates on. Real bulletproof vests use high-strength synthetic polymers like Kevlar or nylon, but I wouldn't even know where to begin trying to synthesize something like that. The way it works is that the fibers catch the bullet particles that get shattered by hitting the armor plates, slowing them down and spreading out their impact so they don't cause as much damage. And while bamboo isn't nearly as strong as Kevlar, it's the strongest thing I have, unless I wanted to try and collect spider silk, which would take forever. And while the fibers will still be pretty coarse and may let small pieces of shrapnel through, the fibers individually may be stronger than smaller polymer ones, just so long as they can handle the tensile stress. I expected this to be kind of hard on the loom, so I liberally greased the machine before starting it up. I then began making the necessary repairs to the dining room set. A few of the bamboo members on the chairs were smashed, but it was mostly the cord-tied joints, the woven meshes of the seats, and the chair backs that got broken. The table itself was pretty solid, it just got turned over. I spent a couple of hours fixing the chairs and replacing the broken members before having lunch and finishing the job. As I was working on this, I realized I needed to think of a way to lock down the bathhouse as well, but making doors for all the large archways would be prohibitive. It would also be nice if I could do something to maintain the aesthetic, so I came up with the idea to make a retractable grating, basically a bunch of crisscrossed pieces of bamboo, which would fold flat when one end of the assembly slides toward the other, kind of like the grates I've seen on old-timey elevators. It wasn't particularly difficult to make, bamboo cord being adequate to make the joints, but the finished product was not particularly sturdy by itself, so I split, hollowed, and trimmed some bamboo to make rails that I could attach to the floor and ceiling of the archways, making them much more resilient to physical impacts, though it wasn't lost on me that a sharp knife would be enough to cut the joints and get inside. But if you're that determined to get into my dining room, you may have other problems. I considered this more of a deterrent than a security measure, as there really wasn't anything critical to my immediate survival in that building. I only had time to build and install 2 of these scissor gates on the bathhouse before it was time to start getting ready for bed, but already they look quite attractive. I'll build the other 2 and a locking mechanism for them tomorrow. As I was winding down for bed, I found there'd been a hitch in the loom that had stopped mesh production, which was annoying, but at least it didn't create an unusable tangle or tear itself apart. I'll have to fix that tomorrow as well. Week 26, Day 5. I got up, checked the horizon, and started my morning chores as usual. When I was done, I fixed the problem with the auto loom and started it running again. While I was in the workshop, I didn't forget this time that the latest plate for the dynamo was finished, so I stopped to remove it and install it and the one I left out the other day. I'm 5 of 10 plates in now, so the next plate should be done tomorrow if the pattern holds. They'll be easier for me to keep track of on a daily basis. I then got back to the scissor gates, building and installing one, stopping for a lunch break, and then building and installing the last one. Next, I needed to build a locking mechanism for them, and in one respect, this was fairly simple. I could just give them all simple latches that could only be accessed from inside the bathhouse, and make a proper lock for just one of the scissor gates. This was a little tricky to make just right, though, because the spaces in the grating were just big enough for a person to fit their hand through, so after thinking about it for a little while, I came up with a sort of knob with a spring in it that had to be held open to keep the grate from locking back into place. Even if it were twisted open from the outside, attempting to open the scissor gate would cause a person's arm to be caught in it, preventing them from opening it any further. I could have just added a regular lock to this mechanism so I could access it with my key, but I had some extra time today and wanted to do something a little more elaborate to keep up my spirits. I had thought about making the cylindrical sections of the pillars rotatable for some kind of puzzle lock, but even by my standards that would be too much work, especially today. Instead, I had an idea for a sort of combination lock that I could build into one of the pillars. I got some pieces of bamboo of various sizes and sort of nested them together and drew symbols on their sides like a combination lock. However, I also added ratchets to their bases such that when I rotated a cross shaft, one of the tumblers would only rotate one way and another tumbler would only rotate the other way. Seems simple enough, but a third tumbler rotates both ways, which makes it a bit of a juggling act to get them all aligned correctly, especially since some of the tumblers have different diameters than the others and will rotate at different rates. Each of these tumblers has a notch in them for a peg to slide into, but the pegs for all the tumblers are connected to each other, so they can only slide into the tumblers once they're all aligned. This opens a latch holding the gate closed. It's certainly overcomplicated for this function, but I enjoyed making it, and I'm beginning to accept that having fun is kind of important for my survival too. At the end of the day, I removed the cap from one of the pillars so I could install the locking mechanism, having to drill some holes into one of the pillar segments first to make the key turn accessible, namely by installing no pegs at all on my master key, and instead giving it a screwdriver-like head to turn the tumblers, and to make the tumblers visible. The concrete was too thick for the tumblers to be turned manually. As a final trick, I got some cord, bamboo, and rocks, and made a pulley system inside the pillar, such that when the mechanism comes unlocked, the weight will fall and pull the scissor gates on either side of the main entrance open automatically, which was great fun to watch. Fiddling with all this made me a little bit late for bed. Week 26, Day 6. It's the last working day of the week, and after I did my morning chores and added a new plate to the dynamo, there was really only one more repair job left. but it was the one I'd been dreading the most, the music machine. That thing was a real labor of love, and so fun to make. So seeing all those delicate mechanisms snapped and smashed was really hard on me. There wasn't a lot I could do, though, but keep moving forward. So I started by replacing the parts that were going to take the longest, namely the clay drums, flutes, xylophone tubes, and sound box for the guitar. I did my best to make them exactly the same sizes and shapes as the original components, though this comparison actually made them harder to make than before, because I was so obsessed with making them exactly like the originals, which I eventually had to just give up on. Next, there were dozens of tiny, delicate hammers and snapped frames to replace, so I decided to start on the frames first. Again, I at least had the benefit of not needing to replace absolutely everything. Just cut pieces of bamboo to length and untie and retie the joints to make everything fit again. It just took a long time and was very disheartening. I stopped halfway through for lunch before finishing the hammers and moving on to the remains of the guitar. The neck was snapped, and I needed to retie and retune the strings. Some of the wood flutes were snapped too, so I had to cut, trim, and hole some new ones. There were lots of string guides on the main part of the music machine which were snapped, so I spent some time replacing them. Finally, the flyback and control mechanisms for the reel needed to be rebuilt, and that was about all I could do for the day. It's mostly put back together now, and could probably work, but I'm sure it needs some additional tweaking and tuning. I can't help but feel, though, that at one time this machine was a joy to me, but now it's kind of a pain to look at, remembering how good it was, and that it may never be that way again. Week 26, Day 7. It's Sabbath, though I didn't get lax on security or checking the horizon in the morning because of it. After my morning chores and popping the clay parts in the kiln, I went to replace the plate of the electrolysis cell and noticed something a little unexpected, namely that although I was still adding plates to the dynamo, it didn't seem to be making them any faster than 1 millimeter per day. I don't really know why. Perhaps that's just its limit. Frankly, I'm surprised the pattern held for as long as it did. I then performed my Bible transcriptions and listened to the sermon on the radio. Unfortunately, nothing so inspiring this week as last week. When it was done, I worked on repairing the music reel that was in the machine when it got smashed up, mostly trying to transcribe the knots from the broken strings on the reel to new ones. I finished up at about lunchtime, and after that, loaded the reel back onto the music machine and started testing it out with what few repaired instruments I had. As I expected, there was still something kind of wonky about it, so I spent an hour making 1,000 minor tweaks to the machine to make it like it was, and that was kind of maddening. I stopped to unload the clay parts from the kiln and left them to cool for a while before installing them and repeating the tweaking process again, sometimes having to stop and replace minor components because they were bent in just the right way to hit a note at just slightly the wrong time or be just off key. I spent most of the remainder of the day doing that, until I decided the machine was good enough and got ready for bed. Blooper reel, I guess. They had a look around the base and tickle in my throat. So I can't just stay hitting to keep the crate from raw. But I had some extra time today and wanted to do. I checked the horizon again when I got up in the morning and started my need to enunciate. There would have been abundant blackberry. Black fairy? What kind of wishes does a black fairy grant? But I managed to find an adequate, though less prolific, substitute here, and wrote down later. Whatever that's supposed to mean. I'm gonna just pause for a text edit. Hold on. Mr. Scott, where are the tribbles? But it was mostly the cord-tied joints, the woven meshes of the seats, chairbacks that got broken. Pause for edits. Basically a bunch of crisscross, but already they look quite attractive. And in one respect, this was fairly simple. I could just give them all simple and drew symbols on their sides like a combination lock. However, like a tumbler combination lock. Like a combination lock. I don't even know what the correct terminology is. Bleh. Let's start that over. Hey there, thanks for listening to the end. Oh boy, I've not been looking forward to this one. But I thought it was important to share this part of my experience, the good and bad sides of me. And I'm certain I'm not the only one who's felt like this. I wrote this during a very hard time in my life, and I felt like the world was against me, there was nothing I could do to change my situation, and that I had no future. This is the way everything feels, but it's not the way they are. And even then, I had enough data to know the difference, and I held on to that. I'm in a much better place now than I was then, and although it's still hard, I'm putting my life back together, and I think I'm finally in a position to gain some traction. I hope this encourages you, and if you feel like talking about what you've been through or are going through, feel free to share it in the comments. And I'm not saying that for the engagement points. I'm saying that because I want to be here to listen. Everyone needs someone like that, and you've been listening to me, so it only seems fair. And your kind comments so far have been part of that data set that keeps me going. Now that I've said the part that I thought was the most important, I should probably do the YouTube stuff. Like if you liked it, don't if you didn't. Subscribe and bell if you want to hear what I do next. Share it with someone you think would like it, or who it reminds you of. Thanks as always for listening, and I hope to see you here again next week.